The year is 1720. Imagine waking up one morning in London and hearing that your neighbor has doubled his fortune in a matter of weeks. A few days later, you learn that a local merchant has become rich enough to buy a country estate. Soon after that, a government clerk, a lawyer, and even a retired sailor are all talking about the same thing. Not war. Not politics. Not religion. They are talking about stocks. Every conversation seems to lead to money. Every newspaper carries stories of rising fortunes. Every coffeehouse is filled with excited investors. People who have never studied business are suddenly discussing share prices. Men who have never owned a company are borrowing money to buy stock. Women who have never invested before are risking family savings. Across Britain, an extraordinary belief is spreading. A belief that wealth has become easy. A belief that anyone can become rich. A belief that prosperity has no limits. And for a brief moment, it seems true. The stock market keeps rising. Fortunes appear overnight. The country feels as though it has discovered a secret formula for endless wealth. Yet hidden beneath the excitement is a dangerous reality. The wealth is not real. The profits are largely imaginary. The promises are exaggerated. And the entire system is resting upon confidence. The moment confidence disappears, everything will begin to collapse. When historians look back on this period, they often focus on the crash. They focus on ruined fortunes, political scandals, and financial panic. But to truly understand the South Sea Bubble, we must first understand the world that created it. Because financial bubbles rarely appear out of nowhere. They grow from deeper conditions. Conditions that make people willing to believe extraordinary promises. Conditions that make risk appear safe. Conditions that encourage hope to overpower reason. Tonight, we will travel back to early 18th century Britain. A country that was becoming one of the most powerful nations on earth. A country filled with ambition. A country burdened by debt. And a country about to learn one of the most expensive lessons in financial history. To begin, we must step back a few years before the bubble itself. We must look at Britain after decades of warfare. For much of the late 17th century and early 18th century, Europe was frequently at war. Kings fought over territory. Dynasties fought over succession. Empires competed for trade routes and influence. Britain was deeply involved in these struggles. Wars were expensive. Armies required weapons, food, uniforms, and transportation. Navies required ships, sailors, supplies, and constant maintenance. Governments needed enormous amounts of money to keep military forces operating. In earlier centuries, rulers often relied upon taxes, loans from wealthy individuals, or emergency measures. But by the early 1700s, warfare had become so expensive that governments needed new financial systems. Britain responded by borrowing heavily. Investors lent money to the government. In return, they received interest payments. At first, this arrangement seemed practical. The government obtained the money it needed. Investors received income. But there was a problem. Each new war created additional debt. Each new loan added another financial obligation. Year after year, the amount owed by the government continued to grow. By the beginning of the 18th century, Britain's national debt had reached levels that many people considered alarming. Today, government debt is a familiar concept. Modern nations regularly borrow money. But in the early 1700s, large national debts were still a relatively new phenomenon. Many people worried about what would happen if the government became unable to meet its obligations. Others feared that rising debt would eventually require higher taxes. Politicians searched for solutions. Merchants discussed the issue. Financial thinkers debated possible reforms. Everyone agreed that the debt needed to be managed. The question was how. At the same time, Britain was changing in other important ways. Trade was expanding. The British Empire was growing. New commercial opportunities were appearing across the globe. Ships connected distant regions. Goods traveled between continents. Investors became increasingly interested in overseas commerce. Stories of exotic markets and foreign wealth captured the public imagination. Many people believed that international trade would create enormous fortunes. In some cases, they were correct. Trade could indeed generate tremendous wealth. But expectations often grew faster than reality. And that tendency would play a major role in the events that followed. As Britain entered the 18th century, two powerful forces were coming together. The first was a government struggling with debt. The second was a public fascinated by the possibility of unlimited wealth through commerce. The South Sea bubble would emerge where those two forces met. And when it finally arrived, millions of hopes, dreams, and fortunes would become tied to a single company. A company whose name would become one of the most famous warnings in financial history. That company was called the South Sea Company. And its story is only just beginning. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's greatest financial disasters, consider subscribing to the channel. These long-form documentaries take us beyond the headlines and into the real stories that shaped the world. Now let's return to London, where the South Sea Company was about to become the center of a nationwide obsession. Before we continue, it is important to remember something that often surprises modern readers. The South Sea Company did not begin as a fraudulent company. It did not start as a secret scam designed to steal money from investors. In fact, many intelligent and respected people believed it could solve one of Britain's biggest financial problems. That is what makes the story so fascinating. The disaster that would eventually unfold was not created by a single villain. It emerged from a mixture of ambition, optimism, politics, and human psychology. To understand how this happened, we need to look at Britain in the year 1711. At the time, Queen Anne sat on the British throne. The government was still dealing with the enormous financial burden created by years of warfare. Interest payments on government debt consumed a significant portion of public finances. Managing that debt had become a national concern. Politicians searched for creative solutions. One of those solutions came from a businessman and politician named John Blunt. Blunt was not a famous military commander. He was not a scientist. He was not a member of the royal family. Instead, he was a financial thinker who believed he had discovered a way to reorganize Britain's growing debt. His proposal appeared clever. Rather than having the government manage countless creditors directly, a private company could take over much of that responsibility. Investors who held government debt would be offered a choice. They could exchange their government bonds for shares in a new company. Instead of receiving interest directly from the government, they would become shareholders. The company itself would receive regular payments from the government for managing the debt. At first glance, the arrangement seemed beneficial for everyone involved. The government could simplify part of its debt structure. Investors would receive shares that might increase in value. And the company would enjoy a steady source of income. The idea gained political support. As a result, the South Sea Company was officially established in 1711. Its name sounded exciting. The phrase, South Sea, referred broadly to regions of South America and surrounding waters. To many people, those distant lands represented mystery, opportunity, and wealth. Europeans had spent centuries telling stories about the riches of the Americas. Tales of gold mines, silver shipments, and prosperous colonies had captured imaginations across the continent. The company's promoters understood the power of those stories. They knew that people were attracted to visions of overseas wealth. And so the South Sea Company was linked not only to government finance, but also to dreams of global commerce. This connection became extremely important. Because if the company had been presented solely as a debt management organization, public excitement might have remained limited. Debt administration sounds practical. International trade sounds exciting. One inspires caution. The other inspires dreams. As the company developed, many investors focused less on the debt arrangement and more on the possibility of future trade profits. This was where reality and expectation began to diverge. The company did receive certain trading rights. However, those rights were far less valuable than many people imagined. To understand why, we must briefly examine the political situation in South America. Most of South America was controlled by Spain. Spain protected its colonial trade carefully. Foreign nations were generally restricted from conducting business within Spanish territories. Britain could not simply send unlimited numbers of ships into Spanish ports and begin trading freely. Access was controlled. Permissions were limited. Commercial opportunities were often constrained by political agreements. In theory, the South Sea Company had access to potentially profitable markets. In practice, those opportunities were much smaller than the public believed. Yet public imagination rarely focuses on limitations. People tend to remember possibilities. They tend to remember the most optimistic version of a story. And optimistic stories were spreading everywhere. Investors imagined fleets of British ships crossing the Atlantic. They imagined warehouses filled with exotic goods. They imagined gold and silver flowing back into Britain. Many assumed that extraordinary profits were inevitable. The truth was more complicated. The company's actual trade operations remained relatively modest. Its financial relationship with the British government was far more important than its commercial activities. But that distinction was not always obvious to the public. And sometimes people prefer not to examine the details too closely. After all, dreams are often more attractive than accounting records. For several years after its creation, the South Sea Company operated without creating a nationwide frenzy. Its shares existed. Investors paid attention to them. Politicians discussed them. But the company had not yet become the center of a national obsession. That transformation would take time. And during those years, something important was happening beneath the surface. Britain's financial system was becoming increasingly sophisticated. More people were learning about investments. More money was flowing through financial markets. And a new culture of speculation was slowly beginning to emerge. The stage was being prepared. The actors were taking their positions. The machinery of the future bubble was quietly assembling itself. Most people did not realize it. Most people could not see what was coming. But the conditions that would eventually produce one of history's greatest financial manias were already falling into place. And in the heart of London, a new institution was helping to spread ideas, rumors, hopes, and financial dreams faster than ever before. That institution was the London Coffee House. And before long, it would play a crucial role in the rise of the South Sea Bubble. If you wanted to understand the financial world of early 18th century Britain, you would not begin in a bank. You would begin in a coffee house. Today, coffee houses are places where people work on laptops, meet friends, or enjoy a quiet drink. In early 18th century London, they served a very different purpose. They were information centers. News traveled through them. Business deals were negotiated inside them. Political arguments filled their rooms. And increasingly, they became the nerve centers of Britain's growing financial system. London was expanding rapidly. Trade connected Britain to Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Merchants needed information. Investors needed information. Ship owners needed information. Everyone wanted to know what was happening in distant parts of the world. A single piece of news could affect fortunes. The arrival of a valuable cargo might increase profits. A war could disrupt trade routes. A treaty could create new opportunities. Information had value. And coffee houses became places where information was bought, sold, exchanged, and debated. Each coffee house developed its own character. Some attracted merchants. Others attracted politicians. Some became popular among writers and intellectuals. A few became closely associated with finance and investment. Inside these establishments, people discussed stocks, government bonds, trade ventures, and business opportunities. There were no smartphones. There was no television. There was no internet. Yet information moved surprisingly fast. A rumor arriving in one coffee house during the morning might spread across much of London by evening. Not all of that information was accurate. In fact, some of it was completely false. But accuracy was not always the most important factor. What mattered was whether people believed it. This would become one of the defining characteristics of the South Sea bubble. Belief often mattered more than reality. Optimism often mattered more than evidence. And stories often traveled faster than facts. As the South Sea Company continued operating during the 1710s, investors regularly discussed its prospects. Some focused on the company's relationship with government debt. Others focused on overseas trade. Many imagined a future in which Britain dominated commerce throughout the Spanish Americas. The details were often unclear. The expectations were enormous. This combination can be dangerous. When expectations become detached from reality, prices can begin moving independently from actual value. At first, that process is difficult to notice. A small increase in price seems reasonable. A larger increase may still appear justified. Success attracts attention. Attention attracts new investors. New investors push prices higher. Higher prices create even more attention. The cycle feeds itself. Long before the dramatic events of 1720, some elements of this process were already visible. Britain's financial markets were becoming more active. Government debt was increasingly traded. Company shares changed hands more frequently. Speculation became more common. A growing number of people began viewing investments not as long-term holdings but as opportunities for quick profits. That shift was important. Traditionally, many investors purchased assets for income. They expected steady returns over time. Speculators had a different goal. They hoped to buy something today and sell it tomorrow at a higher price. The asset itself became less important than the expectation that someone else would pay more later. This mentality would become one of the driving forces behind the South Sea bubble. And it was not limited to wealthy elites. One reason the bubble became so famous is that it reached far beyond traditional financial circles. People from many different social classes became interested. Merchants participated. Lawyers participated. Government officials participated. Landowners participated. Even people with relatively modest savings began exploring investment opportunities. For many, the attraction was obvious. Traditional paths to wealth were slow. Building a business could take years. Managing agricultural land required patience. Professional careers advanced gradually. But stories emerging from London's financial world suggested something different. They suggested that fortunes could be made quickly. Very quickly. A successful investment might produce gains that would otherwise require decades of work. Whether those stories were realistic was another matter entirely. But they were powerful. And powerful stories often influence behavior. By the late 1710s, Britain was becoming increasingly comfortable with financial innovation. People believed they were witnessing the future. New methods of finance seemed sophisticated and modern. The South Sea Company was part of that world. To many observers, it represented progress. A company linked to government finance. A company connected to international trade. A company supported by influential political figures. A company associated with opportunity. What could possibly go wrong? The answer, as history would soon reveal, was quite a lot. Because while public confidence was growing, the company's leadership was developing a plan that would transform the South Sea Company from an important financial institution into the center of one of the greatest speculative manias the world had ever seen. And that plan would begin with Britain's mountain of government debt. By the beginning of 1720, Britain's national debt remained one of the largest financial challenges facing the government. Years of borrowing had created a complex system of obligations. Thousands of investors held government securities. Interest payments had to be made regularly. Politicians wanted stability. Investors wanted profits. And the South Sea Company wanted growth. These interests would soon come together in a way that appeared brilliant. At least at first. The leaders of the South Sea Company believed they could dramatically expand their role in managing government debt. Their proposal was ambitious. The company offered to assume responsibility for a much larger portion of Britain's outstanding debt. In exchange, it would receive valuable financial privileges from the government. On paper, the arrangement seemed elegant. The government could simplify its debt structure. The company could increase its influence. Investors could exchange government debt for company shares. Everyone appeared to benefit. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. The company's directors understood an important truth about human behavior. People become excited when they believe they are participating in a historic opportunity. The debt conversion proposal was presented not merely as a financial transaction. It was presented as a vision of national prosperity. Supporters described it as a transformative moment. A new chapter in Britain's economic future. A chance for investors to participate in extraordinary growth. The language was persuasive. The promises were attractive. And the timing was perfect. Britain was already experiencing growing confidence in commerce and finance. Many people believed the country was entering a new era of wealth. The South Sea Company's proposal seemed to confirm that belief. As news spread, investor enthusiasm began increasing rapidly. More people wanted shares. More people wanted exposure to what they believed would become one of the most profitable enterprises in the world. At this stage, something important happened. The stock price began to rise. Initially, the increase appeared reasonable. Rising demand often pushes prices upward. There was nothing unusual about that. But human psychology has a tendency to transform normal events into extraordinary ones. When investors saw the stock rising, many interpreted the increase as proof that the company must be valuable. The higher the price climbed, the more confident people became. And the more confident they became, the more shares they purchased. This created a feedback loop. Rising prices encouraged buying. Buying created higher prices. Higher prices encouraged even more buying. Each step reinforced the next. Today, economists call this positive feedback. At the time, most investors simply viewed it as success. Few stopped to ask whether the company's underlying business justified such enthusiasm. Instead, attention focused on the market itself. People watched prices. They discussed prices. They celebrated prices. The stock market became a form of entertainment. Newspapers reported developments eagerly. Coffeehouses buzzed with conversation. Speculators shared predictions. Rumors circulated constantly. Some claimed the company would dominate trade across South America. Others predicted unimaginable profits. Every new rumor seemed more optimistic than the last. And optimism proved contagious. One investor told another. That investor told friends. Those friends encouraged relatives. Soon entire social networks were discussing investment opportunities. The fear of missing out began spreading. No one wanted to be left behind. Imagine sitting at a dinner table while everyone around you describes their recent gains. Imagine hearing stories of fortunes made in weeks. Imagine watching neighbors become wealthier while you remain on the sidelines. Resisting such pressure is difficult. It was difficult in 1720. It remains difficult today. As more investors entered the market, demand for South Sea shares accelerated further. Prices climbed steadily upward. People who had purchased shares earlier appeared brilliant. Their success attracted admiration. Their profits attracted imitation. Some investors began borrowing money to buy additional shares. Others sold property to free up capital. Risk seemed unimportant. After all, the market kept rising. And when prices rise long enough, many people begin believing they will continue rising forever. This belief is one of the most dangerous ideas in financial history. Every major bubble has produced it. Every generation eventually discovers that markets can move downward as well as upward. But during a boom, that lesson is often forgotten. The South Sea bubble was no exception. By early spring of 1720, the excitement had become impossible to ignore. The company was no longer merely a financial institution. It was becoming a national obsession. Across Britain, people increasingly viewed South Sea shares as a path to prosperity. Some hoped to improve their lives. Others hoped to become rich. Many believed they were witnessing the future. Few realized they were watching the early stages of a financial mania. And the most explosive phase of that mania had not even begun. Because as share prices continued climbing, a new force would enter the story. Greed. Not ordinary greed, but the kind of greed that convinces intelligent people that normal rules no longer apply. The kind of greed that persuades investors to ignore warning signs. The kind of greed that turns a booming market into a dangerous bubble. And in 1720, that transformation was now underway. As spring turned into summer in 1720, the South Sea Company's stock price continued its astonishing climb. What had begun as enthusiasm was now becoming euphoria. And euphoria can be a powerful force. It changes how people think. It changes how they evaluate risk. Most importantly, it changes what they believe is possible. By this point, many investors were no longer purchasing shares because they understood the company's business. They were buying because the price had been rising. That distinction may sound small. In reality, it is enormous. Investing based on value and investing based on momentum are very different activities. A value investor asks a simple question: what is this asset actually worth? A speculator often asks a different question: what will someone else pay for it tomorrow? During bubbles, the second question tends to dominate. That is exactly what happened in Britain during 1720. The South Sea Company's directors recognized that rising prices created excitement. And excitement attracted more investors. So they introduced a series of new share offerings. Investors could purchase shares through installment payments. Instead of paying the full amount immediately, buyers could pay in stages. This made shares accessible to a much larger number of people. Someone who lacked sufficient cash could still participate. The arrangement seemed convenient. But it also increased risk. People were effectively making commitments based on the expectation that prices would continue rising. As long as the market moved upward, the strategy appeared brilliant. If prices fell, the consequences could be severe. Few investors focused on that possibility. The atmosphere had become overwhelmingly optimistic. Stories of quick profits circulated everywhere. A man who had invested months earlier might now be several times wealthier. A widow who purchased shares at the right moment could suddenly possess more money than she had ever imagined. Merchants discussed investment gains instead of trade. Professionals discussed stock prices instead of their occupations. Even individuals with little financial knowledge became convinced they understood the market. This is another common feature of speculative manias. Success creates confidence. Confidence creates overconfidence. And overconfidence often leads people to underestimate danger. In London's coffeehouses, predictions became increasingly extravagant. Some investors claimed the stock would double again. Others predicted even greater gains. Skeptics were often dismissed. Anyone expressing caution risked appearing foolish. After all, the market seemed to prove the optimists correct every day. The rising stock price became its own advertisement. Each increase attracted fresh buyers. Each fresh buyer helped create another increase. The cycle strengthened itself. And then something remarkable happened. The success of the South Sea Company inspired countless imitators. New companies began appearing across Britain. Some proposed genuine business ventures. Others proposed highly questionable schemes. A few bordered on the absurd. Entrepreneurs realized that investors were eager to fund almost anything that sounded profitable. As a result, proposals emerged for a bewildering variety of enterprises. Some involved overseas trade. Some involved manufacturing. Some involved engineering projects. Others were so vague that nobody could clearly explain how they would generate profits. One famous example reportedly advertised itself as a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. The idea sounds ridiculous today. Yet investors reportedly subscribed anyway. Whether every detail of that story is perfectly accurate remains debated by historians. What matters is that contemporaries believed such stories because they reflected the mood of the era. Speculation had become detached from common sense. People were investing first and asking questions later. The government became concerned. Officials worried that uncontrolled speculation might destabilize the economy. In response, Parliament passed legislation known as the Bubble Act. The law attempted to restrict the formation of unauthorized joint stock companies. Supporters argued that it would protect investors. Critics later suggested that it also helped shield established companies such as the South Sea Company from competition. Regardless of the motivation, the Bubble Act did little to reduce the excitement. If anything, it reinforced the perception that major companies like the South Sea Company possessed special status. Investors interpreted government involvement as reassurance. Many concluded that the company was too important to fail. That assumption would prove costly. Throughout the summer, the stock price surged higher. By June, South Sea shares approached levels that had seemed unimaginable only months earlier. People who had never experienced financial markets before began believing that wealth could be created almost effortlessly. Traditional ideas about value, earnings, and business fundamentals faded into the background. Hope took center stage. Hope is not inherently dangerous. Hope can inspire innovation, exploration, and achievement. But when hope becomes disconnected from reality, it can create illusions. And by the middle of 1720, Britain was living inside one of the greatest financial illusions in its history. The South Sea Company appeared unstoppable. Its supporters celebrated. Its critics struggled to gain attention. Its stock price soared toward extraordinary heights. And somewhere among the thousands of investors watching the market climb was a man whose name would become permanently linked to the bubble. A man who understood mathematics better than almost anyone alive. A man who had explained the laws governing the universe. Sir Isaac Newton. And soon, even he would be swept into the madness. By the summer of 1720, the South Sea Company had become the most talked about investment in Britain. Its shares had risen to extraordinary levels. People who had entered the market early appeared to possess a special kind of genius. Their fortunes grew so quickly that many observers believed they were witnessing the birth of a new financial age. Yet history often teaches a different lesson. When everyone begins believing that wealth has become easy, danger is usually nearby. Among the many investors watching events unfold was Sir Isaac Newton. Today, Newton is remembered as one of the greatest scientists in human history. His discoveries transformed mathematics, physics, and astronomy. He explained gravity. He developed calculus. He revealed principles that still shape our understanding of the universe. To modern audiences, Newton represents intelligence at its highest level. And that is precisely why his involvement in the South Sea Bubble remains so fascinating. People often assume that intelligence provides protection against financial mistakes. The South Sea Bubble suggests otherwise. Newton was not ignorant of finance. He had considerable experience managing money. Over the years, he had accumulated significant wealth. He invested carefully. He monitored economic developments. He was not reckless. In fact, during the early stages of the South Sea boom, Newton acted with remarkable discipline. As share prices rose, he purchased stock and earned substantial profits. Then he did something many investors struggle to do. He sold. By leaving the market while prices were still climbing, Newton locked in impressive gains. From a financial perspective, it was an excellent decision. Had the story ended there, he might be remembered as one of the few famous individuals who successfully navigated the bubble. But the story did not end there. After Newton sold, the market continued rising. And rising. And rising again. Day after day, investors who remained in the market appeared to become richer. Friends made money. Colleagues made money. Neighbors made money. Stories of extraordinary profits spread throughout London. Imagine watching an investment you sold continue doubling in value. Imagine hearing constant reports of fortunes being made. Imagine knowing that you could have earned even more had you stayed invested. This experience is emotionally difficult. Even experienced investors feel its pull. Newton was no exception. Eventually, he re-entered the market. This time he purchased shares at much higher prices. The details of his transactions remain the subject of historical study, but historians generally agree that he invested heavily during the later stages of the boom. In other words, Newton did something surprisingly human. He allowed the fear of missing out to influence his decision-making. The same psychological force that affected ordinary investors affected one of the greatest scientific minds in history. That fact reveals something important. Financial bubbles are not simply economic events. They are psychological events. They exploit emotions that exist in nearly everyone. Greed, envy, optimism, fear, hope, the desire to belong, the fear of being left behind. These emotions do not disappear because someone is intelligent. In some cases, intelligence can even create additional confidence. People may believe they can identify opportunities that others cannot. They may assume they are immune to mistakes. History repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. As Newton and countless others increased their investments, the South Sea Company's valuation reached astonishing heights. By late June and early July, the stock traded near £1,000 per share. Only months earlier, it had traded near £100. The increase was breathtaking. Some investors became fabulously wealthy on paper. The phrase, on paper, is important. A rising stock price creates wealth only if someone is willing to buy at that price. During a bubble, investors often forget this fact. They see increasing numbers and assume the wealth is permanent. But market prices depend upon confidence. And confidence can change quickly. At the peak of the mania, very few people wanted to discuss that possibility. Optimism dominated public conversation. The future seemed bright. The market seemed unstoppable. And the South Sea Company seemed destined for greatness. Yet beneath the celebration, cracks were beginning to appear. A small number of observers had started asking uncomfortable questions. How much profit was the company actually earning? Were its trading operations truly capable of supporting such a valuation? Could the promises being made realistically be fulfilled? These questions did not receive much attention. During bubbles, skepticism is rarely popular. People prefer stories that confirm their hopes. Still, reality has a way of asserting itself. No matter how powerful a narrative becomes, it cannot permanently replace economic fundamentals. Eventually, facts begin demanding attention. And by the second half of 1720, reality was preparing to challenge one of the greatest financial fantasies Britain had ever created. The rise had been spectacular. The fall would be even more dramatic. At the height of the South Sea bubble, Britain appeared intoxicated by wealth. Everywhere people looked, they saw evidence of rising fortunes. Share prices climbed almost daily. Investors celebrated extraordinary gains. And confidence seemed limitless. Yet beneath the surface, a simple question was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. What was the South Sea Company actually worth? For months, that question had been overshadowed by excitement. Most investors were focused on price movements rather than business performance. As long as the stock continued rising, few people demanded detailed answers. But some observers began examining the company's finances more carefully. What they found was troubling. The South Sea Company's market value had grown enormously. Its actual business had not. The company still possessed its government debt arrangements. It still had limited trading privileges. But those assets did not justify the extraordinary prices investors were paying. The gap between perception and reality was becoming dangerously large. In modern financial language, the company's valuation had become detached from its fundamentals. In simpler terms, investors were paying far more for the company than its real economic activity could reasonably support. This did not necessarily mean the company was worthless. Far from it. The South Sea Company possessed genuine assets and government connections. The problem was that expectations had grown far beyond what those assets could realistically deliver. At first, this discrepancy remained hidden by optimism. But eventually, optimism alone is not enough. Markets require buyers. And at extremely high prices, finding new buyers becomes increasingly difficult. Many investors had already committed most of their available money. Others had borrowed heavily. Some were deeply exposed to the fortunes of a single stock. The pool of potential new investors began shrinking. At the same time, a few early investors started taking profits. This was perfectly rational. After all, many had already multiplied their investments several times over. Selling a portion of their holdings allowed them to secure those gains. Initially, such selling caused little concern. The market absorbed it. Prices remained strong. Confidence persisted. But financial bubbles are fragile structures. They depend upon a delicate balance of belief. As long as investors believe prices will continue rising, the system functions. When that belief weakens, even slightly, the entire dynamic can change. Throughout the summer of 1720, subtle signs of nervousness began appearing. Rumors circulated. Questions emerged. Some investors wondered whether the company had become overvalued. Others worried that prices had risen too far, too fast. Most dismissed these concerns. The boom had lasted long enough that many people assumed it would continue indefinitely. That assumption would soon be tested. One of the most important characteristics of a bubble is that nobody knows exactly when confidence will break. The warning signs may be visible for weeks or months. Yet the precise turning point often arrives unexpectedly. That was true in 1720. There was no single dramatic event that instantly destroyed confidence. Instead, sentiment began changing gradually. Investors became slightly more cautious. Buyers became slightly less aggressive. Sellers became slightly more numerous. These small changes may seem insignificant. In reality, they were critical. The market's extraordinary rise had depended on relentless buying pressure. Once that pressure weakened, the upward momentum began fading. For the first time in months, investors faced a possibility they had largely ignored. The possibility that prices might stop rising. When prices pause after a long boom, investors become uneasy. When prices fall, even modestly, anxiety increases. People begin questioning assumptions that once seemed obvious. What if the stock is overpriced? What if future buyers disappear? What if the profits never arrive? What if the dream is wrong? Such questions spread quickly. And unlike optimism, fear often moves with remarkable speed. A hopeful investor may require weeks to commit money. A frightened investor can decide to sell in minutes. By late summer, the emotional atmosphere surrounding the South Sea Company was beginning to shift. Excitement remained. Confidence remained. But uncertainty was growing. Most people still believed the boom would survive. Most people still expected prices to recover from any temporary weakness. Most people still trusted that the company represented Britain's financial future. History shows that major bubbles often look strongest just before they begin collapsing. The South Sea bubble was approaching that moment. The celebration was nearing its end. The wealth that seemed permanent was about to reveal how fragile it really was. And when the collapse finally began, it would move faster than almost anyone imagined. The collapse did not begin with a dramatic announcement. There was no single moment when a bell rang and investors suddenly realized the bubble was over. Instead, confidence began leaking out of the market little by little. At first, the changes seemed minor. A few investors sold shares to secure profits. Others decided they had taken enough risk. Some simply wanted cash after months of speculation. Under normal circumstances, such selling would not have been alarming. But these were not normal circumstances. The South Sea Company's valuation depended heavily upon continued optimism. As soon as optimism weakened, the market's foundations became less stable. The first declines were relatively modest. Many investors viewed them as temporary setbacks. They had seen small fluctuations before. They assumed the stock would soon resume its climb. After all, that had been the pattern for months. Every previous dip had been followed by a recovery. Why should this time be different? That question would soon receive an answer. As prices failed to rebound quickly, concerns spread. Investors who had borrowed money became especially nervous. Their situation was different from that of investors who had used their own savings. A falling stock price did not merely reduce their wealth. It threatened their ability to repay debts. Many had purchased shares using credit. They had assumed future gains would cover their obligations. Now that assumption looked increasingly uncertain. Some lenders demanded repayment. Others required additional collateral. Pressure began building throughout the financial system. When investors could not meet those demands, they often had only one option: sell shares. The problem was that widespread selling created even lower prices. Lower prices triggered additional fear. Additional fear triggered more selling. The cycle that had once pushed prices upward now operated in reverse. During the rise, greed had fed the market. Now fear was feeding it. And fear can be even more powerful. As the decline accelerated, investors rushed to protect themselves. People who had recently celebrated their paper fortunes suddenly became desperate to preserve what remained. The psychology of the crowd changed almost overnight. Months earlier, investors had worried about missing out on profits. Now they worried about losing everything. The same emotions remained present. Only the direction had changed. Coffeehouses that had once echoed with excitement became places of anxiety. Rumors multiplied. Every conversation seemed to bring fresh concerns. Some reports exaggerated the danger. Others underestimated it. Few people knew exactly what was happening. But everyone sensed that something was wrong. The uncertainty itself became a source of panic. Financial markets dislike uncertainty. When investors cannot predict the future, they often choose caution. In 1720, caution increasingly meant selling. The stock price continued falling. Then it fell further. The decline shocked many investors. People who had become wealthy on paper watched their fortunes evaporate. Those who had entered the market near the top suffered particularly severe losses. Months of gains disappeared in weeks. For some, years of savings vanished. For others, debts remained even after their investments had collapsed. The human consequences were devastating. It is easy to discuss bubbles in terms of numbers and charts. But behind every number was a person, a family, a business, a retirement plan, a dream. Many investors had believed the South Sea Company would transform their lives. In a sense it did. Just not in the way they expected. Some families lost substantial portions of their wealth. Merchants faced financial difficulties. Professionals saw savings disappear. Even members of Britain's elite suffered losses. No social class was completely protected. And among the victims was Isaac Newton. The scientist who had successfully exited the market earlier now found himself trapped in the collapse. The exact amount he lost remains debated by historians. However, most estimates suggest that his losses were enormous by the standards of the time. The experience left a deep impression on him. Years later, Newton reportedly expressed frustration with the irrational behavior he had witnessed. His famous observation would become one of the most quoted statements in financial history. He said that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. Whether those were his exact words or a later variation, the sentiment captures an essential truth. Markets are not driven solely by mathematics. They are driven by human behavior. And human behavior can be unpredictable. As the South Sea Company's stock continued collapsing, Britain entered a period of shock. People wanted explanations. How had such a respected company reached this point? How had so many intelligent individuals been deceived? How had so much wealth disappeared so quickly? Those questions would soon lead to investigations. And the answers would reveal a troubling mixture of speculation, manipulation, political influence, and corruption. The financial disaster was only beginning. The scandal that followed would shake the British establishment itself. As the market continued to collapse, public anger began replacing public excitement. Only a few months earlier, the South Sea Company had been celebrated across Britain. Now it was being blamed for one of the greatest financial disasters the country had ever experienced. Investors who had lost fortunes demanded answers. Families who had seen their savings disappear wanted accountability. Politicians who had once praised the company suddenly distanced themselves from it. The mood of the nation changed dramatically. When prices were rising, people had focused on profits. When prices collapsed, they focused on responsibility. Who was to blame? That question quickly became the center of public debate. Parliament could not ignore the crisis. The losses were too large. The outrage was too widespread. An official investigation was launched. As investigators began examining the South Sea Company's operations, disturbing details started emerging. What they discovered shocked many people. The bubble had not been driven solely by optimism and speculation. There was evidence that some company insiders had actively helped fuel the frenzy. Certain directors appeared to have used questionable methods to support the stock price. Influential individuals had received favorable treatment. Political connections had played an important role. The deeper investigators looked, the more troubling the picture became. One of the most controversial findings involved the relationship between the company and powerful figures within the government. Some politicians had been granted shares on unusually favorable terms. Others appeared to have financial interests closely tied to the company's success. These arrangements created serious conflicts of interest. People responsible for protecting the public may also have benefited personally from the company's rising stock price. To ordinary citizens, this looked like corruption. Public anger intensified. Newspapers reported the revelations eagerly. Coffeehouses filled with discussions about scandal and misconduct. The same information networks that had spread optimism during the boom now spread outrage during the crash. Every new revelation seemed to confirm the public's worst fears. The company had not merely failed. It appeared to have operated within a system where financial and political interests were deeply intertwined. Many investors felt betrayed. They had trusted the company. They had trusted the government. Now both institutions faced questions about their conduct. Parliamentary inquiries continued gathering evidence. Witnesses were questioned. Financial records were examined. Relationships between company officials and political leaders were scrutinized. The investigation became one of the most important political events of the era. Eventually, several individuals faced serious consequences. Some company directors lost substantial portions of their personal wealth. Assets were confiscated. Reputations were destroyed. Careers ended. The British government wanted to demonstrate that misconduct would not go unpunished. At the same time, officials faced another challenge. Punishing those responsible was one thing. Stabilizing the financial system was another. Britain's leaders understood that confidence had been severely damaged. Investors were frightened. Credit markets were strained. Economic uncertainty was spreading. If the crisis continued unchecked, the consequences could extend far beyond the stock market. A solution was needed. That solution would come largely through the efforts of a politician named Robert Walpole. Today, Walpole is often remembered as Britain's first de facto prime minister. At the time of the South Sea crisis, he emerged as one of the most important figures in restoring stability. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Walpole recognized that public confidence needed to be rebuilt carefully. The goal was not merely to punish wrongdoing. The goal was to prevent a broader financial collapse. Walpole worked to restructure parts of the damaged financial system. He helped distribute South Sea Company assets and obligations among other institutions. He encouraged measures designed to reduce panic. And perhaps most importantly, he reassured investors that the government would act to preserve stability. The process was not quick. It was not perfect. Many people still suffered severe losses. But over time, confidence gradually returned. Britain's financial system survived. The South Sea bubble had inflicted enormous damage. Yet it did not destroy the nation's economy. Instead, it became something else. A lesson. A warning. A story that future generations would study whenever financial markets became overly enthusiastic. Because the South Sea bubble revealed a truth that remains relevant centuries later. Markets are not governed solely by facts. They are influenced by stories, by expectations, by emotions, and by the powerful belief that this time is different. In 1720, millions of people believed they were participating in a new economic era. Instead, they became participants in one of history's most famous financial collapses. But the most enduring legacy of the South Sea Bubble was not the money that was lost. It was the understanding it gave future generations about the dangers of speculation. And that lesson would echo through the centuries to come. In the years that followed the South Sea Bubble, Britain slowly recovered. The panic faded. The investigations concluded. The headlines moved on. But the memory of the disaster remained. People continued talking about it long after the stock market had stabilized. Parents told the story to their children. Merchants discussed it with business partners. Politicians referenced it during debates. The South Sea Bubble became more than a financial event. It became a cautionary tale. For many Britons, the crash raised an uncomfortable question. How could so many intelligent people have been wrong at the same time? The answer was not simple. Some blamed corruption. Others blamed greed. Some blamed dishonest company directors. Others blamed reckless investors. In reality, all of these factors played a role. But there was also something deeper at work. Something that appears again and again throughout history. Human beings are social creatures. We learn from one another. We imitate one another. And when large groups of people become convinced of something, resisting that belief can be extremely difficult. Imagine standing in a crowded room where everyone appears confident. Everyone seems successful. Everyone insists that a particular opportunity is extraordinary. Most people will eventually begin questioning their own doubts rather than the crowd's certainty. This tendency has existed throughout human history. It influences politics. It influences culture. And it influences financial markets. The South Sea Bubble demonstrated just how powerful collective belief can become. Many investors did not carefully analyze the company's finances. They analyzed the behavior of other investors. If thousands of people were buying shares, they assumed those people must know something valuable. If wealthy individuals were investing, they assumed the opportunity must be legitimate. If respected politicians supported the company, they assumed the risks were limited. Each person's confidence strengthened the confidence of others. The result was a self-reinforcing cycle. Modern economists sometimes describe this as herd behavior. The term sounds simple. Yet its consequences can be enormous. Herd behavior can drive prices far above their true value. It can create booms that appear unstoppable. And when confidence finally breaks, it can create equally dramatic collapses. The South Sea Bubble was one of the earliest large-scale examples of this phenomenon. But it would not be the last. Over the next 3 centuries, remarkably similar patterns would appear again and again. In the 19th century, investors poured money into railway companies. Many railways were useful and profitable. Others were speculative ventures supported by unrealistic expectations. In the 1920s, stock prices in the United States climbed rapidly as investors became convinced that prosperity would continue indefinitely. The result was the famous crash of 1929. Near the end of the 20th century, excitement surrounding Internet companies produced another investment mania. Businesses with little revenue achieved extraordinary valuations simply because they were associated with the Internet. Then came the collapse of the dot-com bubble. In the early 21st century, housing markets in several countries experienced similar enthusiasm. People assumed property prices could only move in one direction. History once again proved otherwise. Although the details changed, the underlying pattern remained familiar. A compelling story emerged. Investors became excited. Prices rose. Success attracted new participants. Expectations expanded. Warnings were ignored. And eventually reality returned. The South Sea Bubble was one of the first major examples of this cycle. That is one reason historians continue studying it. Another reason is that it occurred during a period when modern financial systems were still developing. Britain was learning how large-scale markets functioned. Investors were learning how speculation could distort prices. Governments were learning how financial crises could threaten stability. The lessons were painful, but they influenced future policy and financial thinking. Even today, economists and historians examine the South Sea Bubble when discussing market psychology. The event provides a window into human behavior. It reminds us that technology changes. Governments change. Financial instruments change. But human emotions remain remarkably consistent. Greed in 1720 looked very similar to greed in 1929. Fear in 1720 looked very similar to fear during modern market crashes. Hope, optimism, envy, and overconfidence continue influencing investors just as they did 3 centuries ago. That continuity is one of the most fascinating aspects of financial history. The South Sea Bubble may seem distant. The people involved lived long ago. Their clothing, language, and world were very different from ours. Yet their emotions were familiar. Their dreams were familiar. And their mistakes were familiar. Which is why the story continues to matter today. It is not merely a story about 18th century Britain. It is a story about human nature itself. By the early months of 1720, the South Sea Company's shares had become the most talked about investment in Britain. What had once been a relatively specialized financial enterprise was rapidly becoming a national obsession. Every significant increase in the stock price attracted new attention. Every new investor attracted more investors. And every success story encouraged even greater enthusiasm. The process fed upon itself. As confidence grew, a powerful belief began spreading throughout society. People started to think that extraordinary wealth was no longer reserved for the fortunate few. Perhaps anyone could become rich. Perhaps prosperity was simply a matter of recognizing the opportunity before everyone else. That belief proved irresistible. Across London, conversations increasingly revolved around investments. Coffeehouses buzzed with financial gossip. Merchants discussed stock prices. Lawyers discussed stock prices. Government officials discussed stock prices. Even people with little experience in finance found themselves drawn into the excitement. The South Sea Company stood at the center of this frenzy. But it was not alone. As investors rushed toward anything connected to profit and speculation, a wave of new companies began appearing. Some proposed legitimate business ventures. Others were far less convincing. Promoters recognized that public enthusiasm had created a rare opportunity. People were eager to invest. Money was flowing into the market. And many investors seemed willing to purchase shares without conducting careful research. For ambitious entrepreneurs, the temptation was obvious. Why not create a company and sell shares to an enthusiastic public? Soon, London witnessed an explosion of new schemes. Some promised overseas trade. Others promised mining operations. Some claimed they would develop new technologies. Others proposed insurance ventures, manufacturing projects, or commercial enterprises. A few may have possessed genuine potential. Many did not. What mattered was not the quality of the proposal. What mattered was the ability to attract attention. And attention was becoming easier to obtain. The atmosphere grew increasingly irrational. Investors often purchased shares based on rumors. They followed recommendations from friends. They trusted confident promoters. In many cases, they understood little about the businesses they were funding. One famous example became legendary. A promoter advertised a company described as an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody was to know what it was. The description was intentionally vague. No detailed explanation was provided. No clear business plan was offered. Yet investors reportedly rushed to subscribe. Whether every detail of the story is perfectly accurate remains debated by historians. But the fact that such stories circulated reveals something important. People had become willing to invest first and ask questions later. Speculation was no longer driven primarily by analysis. It was being driven by excitement. And excitement can be contagious. The social pressure was enormous. Imagine watching neighbors make money. Imagine hearing stories of fortunes created in weeks. Imagine learning that friends and colleagues were buying shares and celebrating profits. Remaining cautious suddenly became difficult. People feared missing out. Today we might call it FOMO. The fear of missing out. The emotion is modern. The experience is not. Investors in 1720 felt it just as strongly as investors do today. Every day that prices rose, staying on the sidelines appeared more costly. Those who hesitated worried they were making a mistake. Those who invested felt increasingly confident. The rising market seemed to validate every optimistic prediction. This created a dangerous illusion. People began confusing rising prices with proof. If the stock was climbing, surely the company must be worth more. If everyone wanted shares, surely the opportunity must be genuine. But popularity and value are not the same thing. A crowd can drive prices upward. A crowd cannot change economic reality. Yet during speculative booms, that distinction often becomes blurred. The South Sea bubble was approaching that stage. By the spring and summer of 1720, enthusiasm had reached extraordinary levels. The company's directors encouraged confidence. Political supporters praised the enterprise. New investors continued arriving. And the stock price continued climbing. What had begun as a financial opportunity was becoming something much larger. A national mania. The South Sea Company's shares no longer reflected only the company's prospects. They reflected Britain's hopes, Britain's ambitions, and Britain's dreams of wealth. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the optimism might never end. The future looked limitless. The profits appeared inevitable. And few people wanted to hear voices of caution. Yet beneath the excitement, serious weaknesses remained. The company's trade revenues were still limited. Its promises were still larger than its achievements. Its valuation was still becoming increasingly difficult to justify. Most investors ignored these concerns. After all, prices were rising. And as long as prices continued rising, confidence remained strong. But history has repeatedly demonstrated a simple truth. No market rises forever. No boom lasts indefinitely. And when expectations become detached from reality, the eventual correction can be severe. The South Sea bubble was now approaching its most dangerous moment. The peak was near. Investors believed the future could only get brighter. Few imagined that the collapse was already beginning. And when reality finally arrived, it would destroy fortunes, careers, and dreams across Britain. By the autumn of 1720, the South Sea bubble had largely burst. The dreams remained. The fortunes did not. Across Britain, investors were trying to understand what had happened. Only a few months earlier, many had believed they were participating in the greatest financial opportunity of their lifetimes. Now they were left with losses, debts, and difficult questions. For some people, the consequences were embarrassing. For others, they were devastating. A merchant who had borrowed heavily to purchase shares might suddenly find himself unable to meet his obligations. A family that had invested its savings could see years of careful planning erased. A retired investor who expected financial security might discover that much of his wealth existed only on paper. The collapse affected people differently. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Something had gone terribly wrong. One reason the disaster felt so shocking was that many investors had genuinely believed they were acting rationally. They were not chasing an obviously impossible fantasy. The South Sea Company was a real company. It had government support. It had political connections. It managed significant portions of Britain's debt. These facts made the bubble especially dangerous. The investment was not completely fictional. It was built upon a foundation of truth. The problem was that truth had been surrounded by unrealistic expectations. And unrealistic expectations can be more dangerous than outright lies. An obvious fraud is easier to recognize. A genuine opportunity that becomes wildly exaggerated is much harder to identify. That distinction is important. Many of history's greatest financial bubbles were built on real ideas. Railroads were real. The internet was real. Housing was real. The challenge was not determining whether the underlying idea existed. The challenge was determining how much it was actually worth. The South Sea Bubble followed the same pattern. The company had value. Just not enough value to justify the extraordinary prices investors were paying. As investigations continued, another reality became increasingly clear. The crisis was not simply about money. It was about trust. Financial systems depend on trust. People trust banks to safeguard deposits. Investors trust markets to function fairly. Citizens trust governments to enforce rules. When that trust weakens, financial activity becomes more difficult. After the South Sea collapse, many people questioned institutions they had previously respected. Could company directors be trusted? Could politicians be trusted? Could financial markets be trusted? These concerns extended beyond the South Sea Company itself. They touched the broader relationship between government, business, and the public. Parliament understood the seriousness of the situation. If confidence could not be restored, future economic growth might suffer. Investors might become reluctant to participate in financial markets. Businesses might struggle to raise capital. Government borrowing could become more difficult. The damage could spread far beyond a single company. That is why leaders such as Robert Walpole focused not only on punishment, but also on stabilization. They recognized that confidence, once lost, is difficult to rebuild. Yet rebuilding confidence was exactly what Britain needed. Slowly measures were introduced. Financial obligations were reorganized. Assets were redistributed. Investigations continued exposing misconduct. The government attempted to demonstrate that lessons had been learned. The process was imperfect. Not everyone was satisfied. Many victims never recovered their losses. But over time, the panic began to fade. Markets stabilized. Economic activity resumed. Life moved forward. History often works this way. Even the most dramatic crises eventually become memories. Yet some memories endure longer than others. The South Sea Bubble became one of those memories. Not because it was the largest financial disaster in history. Later generations would witness even larger crashes. Instead, the South Sea Bubble endured because it revealed timeless truths about human behavior. Truths that future generations would repeatedly rediscover. And among those truths was a lesson that remains just as relevant today as it was in 1720. The greatest danger in a bubble is rarely the asset itself. The greatest danger is the belief that prices can only go up. That belief had captured Britain. And it had cost the nation dearly. But the story of the South Sea Bubble was not finished yet. Because its most important legacy would emerge long after the stock certificates had lost their value. Its true legacy would be the lessons it left behind. When people think about financial bubbles, they often imagine greed. And greed certainly played a role in the South Sea Bubble. But if we look more closely, another force was equally important. Hope. Hope convinced investors that extraordinary profits were possible. Hope encouraged them to overlook risks. Hope persuaded intelligent people that the future would be brighter than the past. In moderation, hope is valuable. It inspires exploration. It encourages innovation. It motivates people to take productive risks. But when hope becomes detached from reality, it can become dangerous. The South Sea bubble demonstrated this with remarkable clarity. Many investors were not attempting to deceive anyone. They genuinely believed they were making wise decisions. They studied the market. They listened to experts. They followed respected public figures. And because so many other people appeared confident, they became more confident themselves. This process is surprisingly common. Human beings rarely make decisions in complete isolation. We observe others. We learn from others. And when uncertainty exists, we often assume that large groups possess knowledge we lack. Psychologists sometimes refer to this tendency as social proof. If enough people appear convinced of something, that belief itself becomes evidence. During ordinary circumstances, social proof can be useful. It helps people navigate complex situations. But during speculative manias, it can become misleading. When everyone is watching everyone else, confidence can spread without any connection to reality. The South Sea bubble became a textbook example. Investors purchased shares because other investors were purchasing shares. Rising prices attracted new buyers. Those new buyers pushed prices higher. The higher prices then attracted even more buyers. At a certain point, the cycle became self-sustaining. The stock's popularity became its primary source of value. This phenomenon has appeared repeatedly throughout history. In every era, people convince themselves that a particular opportunity is different from anything that came before. The language changes. The technology changes. The details change. But the underlying psychology remains remarkably consistent. Investors begin by focusing on genuine opportunities. Then expectations grow. Success attracts attention. Attention attracts speculation. Speculation attracts excess. And eventually, excess creates vulnerability. The South Sea bubble followed this pattern almost perfectly. What makes the story particularly fascinating is that many warning signs were visible before the collapse. A few observers questioned the company's valuation. Some expressed concerns about unrealistic expectations. Others warned that prices had risen too quickly. Yet those warnings received little attention. Why? Because warning signs are difficult to hear during a boom. When investors are making money, caution sounds pessimistic. Skepticism sounds unnecessary. Criticism sounds foolish. People naturally prefer information that confirms what they already hope is true. Modern psychologists call this confirmation bias. The concept is simple. Individuals tend to seek evidence that supports existing beliefs while ignoring evidence that challenges them. The investors of 1720 were not uniquely irrational. They were behaving in ways that remain familiar today. That realization may be uncomfortable. It suggests that financial bubbles are not merely historical accidents. They are recurring features of human behavior. Whenever large groups become excited about wealth, similar dynamics can emerge. This does not mean markets are inherently dangerous. Markets have helped finance businesses, innovations, and economic growth for centuries. The problem arises when expectations become disconnected from reality. The South Sea bubble provides one of history's clearest examples of this separation. For a brief period, investors stopped asking what the company was worth. Instead, they focused on what they hoped it would become. The difference between those two questions proved enormously expensive. Yet perhaps the most remarkable lesson involves Isaac Newton. History remembers Newton as a symbol of reason. A man who explained natural laws with extraordinary precision. A thinker capable of solving problems that baffled others. And yet he lost money in the bubble. Not because he lacked intelligence. Not because he failed to understand mathematics, but because he was human. His experience reminds us that knowledge alone cannot eliminate emotional influence. Even the most brilliant individuals remain vulnerable to optimism, fear, and social pressure. That may be one of the most enduring lessons of the entire story. The South Sea Bubble was not simply a failure of finance. It was a demonstration of human nature. And that is why people continue discussing it more than 3 centuries later. Because whenever markets become euphoric, the ghosts of 1720 quietly return. The names change. The assets change. The promises change. But the emotions remain strikingly familiar. More than 300 years have passed since the South Sea Bubble burst. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies have transformed the world. Entire industries have appeared that people in 1720 could never have imagined. Yet the story remains surprisingly modern. In fact, one of the most remarkable aspects of the South Sea Bubble is how familiar it feels. If a modern investor traveled back to London in 1720, many details would seem strange. The clothing would be different. The streets would be different. The language would sound unfamiliar. But the conversations about money would feel surprisingly recognizable. People would still be discussing the next great opportunity. They would still be sharing success stories. They would still be predicting enormous profits. And they would still be convincing themselves that the future would be brighter than anyone expected. That continuity reveals something important. Financial markets are built from human decisions. And human nature changes much more slowly than technology. Throughout history, investors have repeatedly encountered the same emotional challenges. They struggle with patience. They struggle with fear. They struggle with greed. They struggle with uncertainty. The South Sea Bubble did not create these tendencies. It merely exposed them. That is one reason the event became such an important case study for economists and historians. The bubble demonstrated that markets are not always perfectly rational. Prices do not always reflect reality. Sometimes they reflect emotions. Sometimes they reflect stories. Sometimes they reflect dreams. During the South Sea Bubble, many investors purchased shares because they believed future buyers would pay even higher prices. The actual business became secondary. The expectation of future demand became primary. This distinction lies at the heart of many speculative booms. When investors focus on value, they ask what an asset can produce. When investors focus on speculation, they ask what someone else might pay. For a time, both approaches can appear successful. But eventually, reality asserts itself. A company must generate profits. A business must create value. A price must be supported by something more than enthusiasm. The South Sea Company struggled to meet those expectations. And when confidence weakened, the gap between perception and reality became impossible to ignore. That moment arrives in nearly every bubble. Sometimes it arrives gradually. Sometimes it arrives suddenly. But it always arrives. The exact timing remains unpredictable. The outcome is not. What makes bubbles particularly dangerous is that they often contain elements of truth. Completely unrealistic ideas rarely attract millions of investors. Successful bubbles usually begin with something genuine. A promising technology. A growing industry. A new market. A legitimate opportunity. The South Sea Bubble contained genuine elements as well. Britain's financial system was evolving. International trade was expanding. The company possessed real assets and government connections. The problem was not that investors believed in something entirely fictional. The problem was that they allowed reasonable expectations to become unreasonable expectations. That transition can be difficult to recognize while it is happening. In hindsight, bubbles often appear obvious. During the event itself, they rarely feel obvious. Most participants believe they are acting sensibly. Most believe the future will justify current prices. Most believe that concerns are exaggerated. Only later does the full picture become clear. The South Sea bubble reminds us of this reality. It reminds us that confidence can become excessive. It reminds us that success can create overconfidence. And it reminds us that financial markets are ultimately reflections of human behavior. Perhaps that is why the story has survived for centuries. Not because of the money. Not because of the politics. Not even because Isaac Newton was involved. The story survives because it teaches something universal. It teaches that intelligence does not eliminate emotion. It teaches that crowds can be wrong. And it teaches that extraordinary promises deserve extraordinary scrutiny. These lessons were relevant in 1720. They were relevant in 1929. They were relevant during the dot-com boom. And they remain relevant today. The South Sea bubble may belong to history. But the forces that created it are still very much alive. And that is why the story continues to matter. As the years passed, Britain gradually transformed the disaster into a lesson. Financial institutions became more cautious. Investors became more skeptical. Politicians became more aware of the risks associated with speculation. The South Sea bubble entered public memory as a warning. Yet warnings have a curious limitation. Every generation believes it will recognize the mistakes of the previous one. And every generation eventually discovers that recognizing a mistake in history is much easier than recognizing it in the present. People reading about the South Sea bubble decades later often wondered how investors could have behaved so irrationally. How could they have ignored obvious warning signs? How could they have believed such extraordinary promises? But those same questions would later be asked about other bubbles. And they will likely be asked again in the future. That is because financial manias are not primarily failures of information. They are failures of judgment. The necessary information often exists. Warning signs often exist. Skeptics often exist. What changes is the willingness of people to listen. During a boom, optimism becomes persuasive. Success becomes persuasive. Wealth becomes persuasive. And caution struggles to compete. The South Sea bubble revealed this dynamic with exceptional clarity. For a brief period, Britain convinced itself that a financial innovation had unlocked extraordinary prosperity. The belief felt convincing. The evidence appeared convincing. The rising stock price seemed to confirm the story. But stories and reality are not always the same thing. When reality finally arrived, it arrived with great force. The result was one of the most famous market collapses in history. Yet the story does not end with failure. It ends with understanding. Because from the wreckage emerged valuable insights about markets, incentives, regulation, and human psychology. Those insights influenced future generations. They helped shape the development of modern finance. And they continue informing discussions about investment and speculation today. Perhaps the greatest lesson is also the simplest. No asset rises forever. No opportunity is risk-free. And no crowd, regardless of its size, is infallible. The investors of 1720 learned these lessons through painful experience. Their losses became part of financial history. Their mistakes became part of financial education. And their story became one of the most enduring examples of what can happen when hope outruns reality. For Isaac Newton, the bubble provided a humbling reminder that even extraordinary intelligence has limits. For Britain, it exposed weaknesses within both financial markets and political institutions. For future generations, it offered a case study in the power of collective belief. And for us, more than 3 centuries later, it offers something else. Perspective. A chance to recognize that the forces shaping markets are not merely economic. They are deeply human. As long as people dream of easy wealth, speculative bubbles will remain possible. As long as people fear being left behind, markets will occasionally become irrational. And as long as those tendencies exist, the story of the South Sea Bubble will continue to be told. Not simply as a tale of money lost, but as a tale of human nature revealed. The company is gone. The investors are gone. The coffeehouses have changed. The world they knew has vanished. Yet their story survives. A reminder from 1720. A reminder that markets can rise far beyond reason. A reminder that confidence can become dangerous. And a reminder that even the wisest minds can be swept away when an entire nation begins chasing a dream. By the time the South Sea Bubble had faded into history, Britain had learned a lesson that would echo far beyond the 18th century. Yet there is another question worth asking. Why do financial bubbles keep happening? If the South Sea Bubble became so famous, why did later generations fail to avoid similar mistakes? The answer lies in a simple reality. Every bubble believes it is different. People living through a speculative boom rarely think they are repeating history. Instead, they believe they are witnessing something new, something unique, something that changes the rules. Investors in 1720 believed international trade would create unprecedented wealth. Investors in later centuries believed railroads would transform economies. Others believed automobiles would reshape society. Still others believed radio, television, computers, the internet, or housing markets would produce endless prosperity. In many cases, these technologies and industries genuinely changed the world. The mistake was not recognizing their importance. The mistake was assuming that importance justified any price. This distinction matters enormously. A great innovation can still become a poor investment if investors pay too much for it. The South Sea Bubble demonstrates this principle perfectly. The company was connected to real economic activity. It managed government debt. It possessed trade privileges. It operated within an expanding global economy. But none of those facts justified the extraordinary valuations reached during the bubble. Expectations grew faster than reality. And eventually reality caught up. This pattern has repeated throughout financial history. The details vary. The psychology remains remarkably consistent. At the beginning of a boom, early investors often identify a genuine opportunity. They earn legitimate profits. Their success attracts attention. New participants enter the market. Prices rise further. Optimism increases. Soon, speculation begins replacing analysis. People focus on gains rather than risks. Stories become more important than evidence. Skeptics become unpopular. At the peak, many investors stop asking whether an asset is worth its price. Instead, they ask how much higher the price might go. That shift is often a warning sign. When future expectations become the primary justification for current prices, markets become vulnerable. Eventually, something changes. Perhaps growth slows. Perhaps profits disappoint. Perhaps confidence simply weakens. Whatever the trigger, the cycle begins reversing. The optimism that once fueled buying becomes uncertainty. Uncertainty becomes fear. Fear becomes panic. And prices fall. The South Sea Bubble followed this pattern so clearly that economists continue studying it centuries later. It serves as one of the earliest detailed examples of speculative behavior on a national scale. But the story is not only about markets. It is also about society. The bubble revealed how closely finance, politics, and public opinion could become connected. During the boom, many politicians supported the company. Many influential figures benefited from rising prices. Many newspapers repeated optimistic narratives. The entire environment encouraged confidence. When the crash arrived, that confidence disappeared. Public trust suffered. Questions emerged about accountability and responsibility. These concerns remain relevant today. Modern financial systems are far more sophisticated than those of 1720. Regulations are stronger. Information travels faster. Markets are larger. Yet the relationship between finance, politics, media, and public opinion remains important. The South Sea Bubble reminds us that financial crises rarely exist in isolation. They affect institutions. They affect governments. And they affect ordinary people. That is why historians continue examining the event. Not because it was the largest bubble. Not because it was the first speculative mania. But because it revealed fundamental truths about how societies respond to wealth, risk, and uncertainty. In many ways, the South Sea Bubble was a mirror. It reflected Britain's ambitions. It reflected Britain's optimism. And ultimately, it reflected Britain's vulnerabilities. The same could be said of many later bubbles. When historians study financial manias, they are not merely studying markets. They are studying human hopes and fears. They are studying the stories people tell themselves about the future. And they are studying what happens when those stories become more powerful than reality. That is why the South Sea Bubble remains relevant. Not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of patterns that continue to appear whenever excitement, opportunity, and human nature come together. As the South Sea Bubble receded into the past, Britain entered a new phase of economic development. Trade continued to expand. Industry continued to grow. Financial markets continued to evolve. The collapse had caused immense damage, but it had not stopped progress. In fact, one of the most surprising aspects of financial history is that major bubbles often occur during periods of genuine economic advancement. This may seem contradictory. If a bubble ends in disaster, why does it frequently emerge alongside real growth? The answer is that optimism often begins with something real. People become excited because they can see genuine opportunities. The problem arises when reasonable optimism transforms into unreasonable certainty. That transformation is subtle. And it can happen more quickly than most people realize. Consider Britain in the early 18th century. The country was becoming a major commercial power. Its financial institutions were becoming more sophisticated. Its global trade networks were expanding. Many investors correctly recognized that economic change was underway. Where they went wrong was in assuming that every opportunity connected to that change would generate extraordinary profits. The South Sea Company became a symbol of that assumption. Investors projected their hopes onto the company. They saw not merely a business, but a vision of the future. The stock price reflected those hopes. Eventually, it reflected little else. When expectations become detached from reality, prices become fragile. That fragility was exposed in 1720. Yet the story contains another lesson that is often overlooked. The most dangerous phase of a bubble is usually not the beginning. It is the middle. During the early stages, uncertainty still exists. People remain cautious. Debates continue. Skeptics have a voice. But after a period of success, confidence grows stronger. Investors begin viewing rising prices as proof that their assumptions are correct. The market appears to validate itself. This creates a powerful illusion. Because rising prices do not necessarily prove that an asset is valuable. They merely prove that demand currently exceeds supply. The distinction is crucial. During the South Sea Bubble, many people interpreted price increases as evidence of future prosperity. In reality, the price increases were often evidence of growing speculation. The same misunderstanding has appeared repeatedly throughout history. People see an asset becoming more expensive and assume it must therefore be more valuable. Sometimes that assumption is correct. Often it is not. This confusion between price and value lies at the heart of many financial disasters. The South Sea bubble remains one of the clearest examples. The company possessed real value. Its stock price eventually reflected something very different. At the peak of the mania, investors were paying not for present reality, but for imagined futures. And imagined futures are difficult to measure. They are difficult to challenge. Most importantly, they are difficult to resist. After all, who wants to be the person predicting limits during a time of apparent abundance? Who wants to be the voice of caution when others are becoming rich? This social pressure played an important role in the bubble. People did not make decisions in isolation. They observed neighbors, friends, business partners, and public figures. Every success story encouraged further participation. Every new investor reinforced the collective belief. The crowd itself became part of the investment thesis. This phenomenon continues to appear in modern markets. Whenever investors begin saying, "Everyone is buying it," they are often revealing that social influence has become part of the decision-making process. The South Sea bubble reminds us that popularity and value are not the same thing. An asset can be widely admired and still be overpriced. A company can be respected and still be overvalued. A market can be enthusiastic and still be wrong. These truths may sound obvious in hindsight. They rarely feel obvious during a boom. That is why bubbles continue occurring. Not because history is forgotten, but because human emotions remain remarkably consistent. The investors of 1720 were not uniquely foolish. They were responding to incentives, stories, and social pressures that remain familiar today. Understanding that fact is perhaps one of the most valuable lessons the South Sea bubble can offer, because it transforms the story from a historical curiosity into something far more meaningful: a study of human behavior itself. By the middle of the 18th century, the South Sea bubble had become part of British memory. People still referred to it. Writers still discussed it. Politicians still cited it as a warning. Yet memories have a curious tendency to change over time. As years pass, complex events are often simplified. The South Sea bubble was no exception. Many people remembered it merely as a story about greed. Others remembered it as a story about corruption. Some remembered it as proof that financial markets were dangerous. Each interpretation contained part of the truth. None contained the entire truth. The real story was more complicated. The bubble involved greed, but it also involved hope. It involved corruption, but it also involved innovation. It involved speculation, but it also involved genuine economic change. That complexity is what makes the event so fascinating. History is rarely divided into heroes and villains. More often, it involves ordinary people making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. The investors of 1720 did not know how the story would end. They were not reading a history book. They were living through events as they unfolded. Each decision seemed reasonable at the time. Each step felt justified. The final outcome only became obvious after the collapse. This perspective is important because it encourages humility. When modern observers examine historical bubbles, it is easy to believe we would have acted differently. Perhaps some would have. Many would not. Human beings have a natural tendency to believe they are less vulnerable to mistakes than others. Psychologists call this the bias blind spot. People readily identify errors in the judgment of others while overlooking similar tendencies in themselves. The South Sea bubble challenges that confidence. It reminds us that intelligence alone is not enough. Experience alone is not enough. Even knowledge of history is not always enough. Avoiding mistakes requires discipline. It requires skepticism. It requires the willingness to question popular narratives. Those qualities are difficult to maintain when excitement is widespread. That is why bubbles often grow so large. And that is why they remain so fascinating. The South Sea Bubble was not simply an economic event. It was a social event, a political event, a psychological event, and ultimately, a human event. Its lessons extend far beyond finance. They touch on leadership, decision-making, group behavior, and the challenges of navigating uncertainty. More than 3 centuries later, those lessons remain remarkably relevant. Because while the world has changed dramatically, human nature has changed very little. The same hopes continue inspiring people. The same fears continue influencing decisions. And the same temptation to believe in easy wealth continues appearing in new forms. The South Sea Bubble may belong to the past, but the forces that created it continue shaping the present. And perhaps they always will. As historians look back on the South Sea Bubble today, one question continues to stand out. Was the disaster inevitable? Could Britain have avoided the crash? Or was the bubble destined to burst from the moment it began? The answer depends on how one views history. Some scholars argue that the collapse became unavoidable once expectations detached themselves from economic reality. Others believe that better regulation, greater transparency, and more responsible leadership might have reduced the damage. There is truth in both perspectives. The South Sea Company did possess real assets. It managed government debt. It had political support. It operated within a growing economy. Had expectations remained reasonable, the company might have remained an important financial institution without becoming the center of a national mania. But expectations did not remain reasonable. They expanded rapidly. And once millions of pounds of wealth depended upon ever-rising prices, stability became increasingly difficult to maintain. One of the great challenges in financial markets is that success often creates the conditions for future problems. A rising market attracts attention. Attention attracts money. Additional money pushes prices higher. Higher prices create stories of success. Those stories attract even more participants. The process can continue for far longer than critics expect. This is one reason bubbles are so difficult to identify in real time. Many of the people warning about danger appear wrong for months or even years. Meanwhile, those embracing the boom appear correct. The South Sea Bubble followed this pattern. During the rise, skeptics looked foolish. During the collapse, they looked prophetic. Yet, even that observation can be misleading. Predicting that a bubble exists is easier than predicting when it will end. Many investors who recognized the risk still struggled to act upon that knowledge. Some sold too early. Others waited too long. The timing problem remains one of the most difficult challenges in investing. Even Isaac Newton encountered it. His experience is particularly revealing. Newton recognized that prices had risen dramatically. He initially sold and secured substantial profits. Then he watched prices continue climbing. Eventually, he re-entered the market. His mistake was not a lack of intelligence. It was a reminder that emotions influence decision-making even when knowledge is abundant. That lesson remains relevant today. Financial markets are not contests of intelligence alone. They are environments where psychology matters. Patience matters. Discipline matters. And self-awareness matters. The South Sea Bubble illustrates what can happen when these qualities become overwhelmed by excitement. At its core, the story is about the relationship between reality and belief. Reality moves slowly. Businesses generate profits gradually. Trade expands over years. Economic growth takes time. Belief can move much faster. Expectations can change overnight. Optimism can spread through an entire society in a matter of weeks. During a bubble, belief often races far ahead of reality. For a while, that imbalance may appear harmless. Prices rise. Investors celebrate. Confidence grows. But eventually, reality demands attention. And when it does, adjustments can be painful. That adjustment arrived in 1720. It arrived for wealthy aristocrats. It arrived for merchants. It arrived for government officials. And it arrived for ordinary citizens who had hoped to improve their lives through investment. The losses varied. The disappointment was widespread. Yet the story did not end in complete ruin. Britain recovered. Its financial system survived. Its economy continued growing. The crisis became a lesson rather than a permanent catastrophe. Perhaps that is another reason the South Sea Bubble remains so important. It demonstrates both the dangers and the resilience of financial systems. Markets can make mistakes. Societies can make mistakes. But recovery is possible. Learning is possible. Progress is possible. The challenge is ensuring that lessons are remembered before the next period of excitement begins. History suggests that this is easier said than done. As our journey through the South Sea Bubble draws toward its conclusion, it is worth reflecting on why this story continues to capture attention more than 3 centuries after the events took place. Many financial crashes have occurred since 1720. Some were larger. Some affected more people. Some produced greater economic damage. Yet the South Sea Bubble remains one of the most famous. Part of the reason is timing. The event occurred during the early development of modern finance. Many of the institutions, practices, and market behaviors that feel familiar today were still taking shape. The bubble offered one of the first large-scale demonstrations of how powerful financial markets could become. It also demonstrated how dangerous they could be when optimism outran reality. Another reason for its enduring fame is Isaac Newton. History is filled with wealthy investors who lost money. Few of them changed the course of science. Newton's involvement transformed the bubble into something larger than a financial story. It became a reminder that intelligence does not provide immunity from human emotion. Even one of the greatest thinkers in history could be influenced by the same forces affecting everyone around him. That realization remains striking. It reminds us that the challenge of investing is not merely intellectual. It is emotional. The most difficult questions are often not about mathematics. They are about behavior. Can investors remain patient when others are getting rich quickly? Can they remain skeptical when optimism dominates public conversation? Can they resist the pressure of the crowd? These questions were relevant in 1720. They remain relevant today. Perhaps the most important legacy of the South Sea Bubble is that it encourages humility. It reminds us that certainty can be dangerous. It reminds us that markets can surprise even experienced participants. And it reminds us that no generation possesses a monopoly on wisdom. Every era believes it has discovered something new. Every era believes previous mistakes are unlikely to be repeated. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. New technologies emerge. New industries develop. New opportunities appear. And alongside those opportunities come familiar emotions. Hope. Ambition. Greed. Fear. Confidence. Doubt. The South Sea Bubble was shaped by all of them. That is why the story continues to resonate. Not because it belongs to a distant past, but because it reveals something enduring about human nature. The people who crowded London's coffeehouses in 1720 were separated from us by centuries. Yet in many ways, they were not so different. They wanted security. They wanted prosperity. They wanted a better future. And like many people throughout history, they sometimes confused possibility with certainty. Their experience became one of the earliest great warnings in financial history. A warning about speculation. A warning about excessive optimism. And a warning about the dangers of believing that prices can rise forever. The South Sea Company itself eventually faded from prominence. The bubble burst. The fortunes vanished. The headlines disappeared. But the lessons endured. And so, more than 300 years later, the story still survives. A story of ambition. A story of wealth. A story of illusion. And ultimately, a story of human nature. Because long after the stock certificates turned to paper and the fortunes turned to memories, one truth remained. Markets change. Technology changes. Governments change. But people remain remarkably the same. And that may be the most important lesson the South Sea Bubble has to teach. To truly understand the legacy of the South Sea Bubble, we need to look beyond the stock market itself. The collapse was not merely a financial event. It changed the way Britain thought about money, risk, and government responsibility. Before 1720, organized financial markets were still relatively new. Many people viewed them with excitement. Some viewed them with curiosity. Very few fully understood the dangers they could create. The South Sea Bubble changed that. For the first time, an entire nation had witnessed what could happen when speculation spread beyond professional investors and into society as a whole. The lessons were painful. But they were impossible to ignore. One consequence was a growing demand for accountability. Citizens wanted to know why powerful individuals had been allowed to profit, while ordinary investors suffered losses. The parliamentary investigations revealed uncomfortable truths. Political influence had played a role. Conflicts of interest had played a role. Weak oversight had played a role. These revelations damaged public trust. But they also encouraged reforms. Over time, governments became more aware of the importance of financial supervision. The process was gradual. It would take generations for modern regulatory systems to emerge. Yet the South Sea Bubble helped start that conversation. Another important consequence involved public attitudes towards speculation itself. For many years after the crash, people spoke about stock market investing with greater caution. The memory of ruined fortunes remained vivid. Stories of the bubble circulated widely. Parents warned children about reckless speculation. Writers used the event as a symbol of greed and excess. Politicians referenced it when discussing economic policy. The bubble became part of British culture. It entered the national imagination. Even people who knew little about finance often recognized the phrase, South Sea Bubble. That cultural memory mattered. It influenced behavior. It shaped public debates. And it reminded future generations that financial excitement could carry serious risks. Yet history also reveals something interesting. Memories fade. Not immediately. Not completely. But gradually. The generation that experiences a crisis remembers it vividly. The next generation hears stories about it. The generation after that often treats it as distant history. As memories weaken, confidence returns. New opportunities emerge. New narratives appear. And eventually, new bubbles form. This pattern has repeated throughout history. The South Sea Bubble was remembered. Its lessons were discussed. Yet later generations still experienced speculative manias of their own. The reason is simple. Knowledge of history does not automatically overcome human emotion. People rarely believe they are participating in a bubble. They usually believe they are participating in progress. That distinction is crucial. Very few investors in 1720 thought they were part of a financial mania. Most believed they were witnessing extraordinary economic opportunity. The same has been true in many later booms. Participants focus on potential rewards. Risks appear manageable. warning signs appear exaggerated. And because prices continue rising, confidence grows stronger. The South Sea Bubble reminds us that this process is not new. It has deep historical roots. The technology changes. The language changes. The assets change. But the emotional patterns remain remarkably similar. Perhaps that is why historians continue studying the event. Not because it tells us exactly what future markets will do. No historical event can provide that certainty. Instead, it helps us understand how people behave when confronted with the possibility of extraordinary wealth. And understanding that behavior may be one of the most valuable forms of knowledge history can offer. Because markets are ultimately collections of human decisions. To understand markets, we must first understand people. The South Sea Bubble remains one of the clearest windows into that reality. And more than 3 centuries later, its lessons still echo through every major financial center in the world. Among all the individuals connected to the South Sea Bubble, none has attracted more attention than Sir Isaac Newton. 3 centuries later, his name remains inseparable from the story. Not because he caused the bubble. Not because he managed the company. But because his experience revealed something profound about human nature. For generations, people have looked at Newton as the ultimate symbol of intelligence. His work transformed science. His theories helped explain the universe. His mathematical achievements remain extraordinary even today. If anyone should have been able to recognize a speculative mania, many people assume it would have been Newton. Yet history rarely works that way. The skills required to understand physics are not necessarily the same skills required to navigate mass psychology. Newton understood gravity. He understood motion. He understood mathematics. What he could not fully control were the emotions that influence human decision-making. And in that respect, he was no different from millions of people throughout history. The exact amount Newton lost remains debated among historians. Records from the period are incomplete. Different estimates have been proposed. Most scholars agree, however, that his losses were substantial. Some estimates suggest that he lost around £20,000. To a modern audience, that number may not sound extraordinary. But in the early 18th century, it represented an enormous fortune. Adjusted for modern purchasing power, it would amount to many millions of dollars. The loss did not leave Newton destitute. This is an important point. Popular retellings sometimes claim that Newton was ruined or driven into poverty. That is not accurate. Newton remained a wealthy man by the standards of his era. He continued serving as Master of the Royal Mint. He maintained his social standing. He retained considerable assets. Yet the losses were still painful. Painful enough that he reportedly refused to discuss the South Sea Bubble in later years. Whether every anecdote about Newton's reaction is perfectly accurate remains uncertain. Historians often debate the reliability of stories repeated long after the event. But there is little doubt that the experience affected him deeply. And perhaps that is understandable. Imagine making a decision that appears wise. Imagine taking profits and leaving the market. Imagine watching prices continue rising. Then imagine returning at higher prices because everyone around you appears to be getting richer. Finally, imagine losing a substantial portion of your fortune. The emotional impact would be significant. Newton's experience illustrates a challenge that investors continue facing today. Success can create pressure. Watching others become wealthy can create pressure. Being correct can be difficult. Remaining correct while others appear more successful can be even harder. This may explain why Newton re-entered the market. His first decision was disciplined. His second decision was emotional. And that combination is remarkably human. In many ways, Newton became the perfect symbol of the bubble. Not because he was foolish, but because he was intelligent. If someone of his ability could become caught up in the mania, then perhaps the problem was not individual ignorance. Perhaps the problem was something larger. Something rooted in human psychology itself. That idea continues to resonate. Whenever modern investors hear Newton's story, they recognize a familiar struggle. The struggle between logic and emotion. The struggle between patience and excitement. The struggle between independent thinking and social pressure. Those conflicts existed in 1720. They exist today. And they will likely exist as long as financial markets continue operating. That is why Newton's story remains so powerful. It transforms the South Sea Bubble from an abstract economic event into a deeply personal one. A reminder that even extraordinary intelligence has limits. And a reminder that markets often test not what we know, but how we behave. One of the most important figures to emerge from the South Sea Bubble was not a trader, an investor, or a company director. It was a politician. His name was Robert Walpole. Today, many historians refer to him as Britain's first Prime Minister. But in 1720, he was something else. He was one of the few senior political leaders who understood the danger facing the nation after the crash. When the bubble burst, Britain faced more than angry investors. It faced a crisis of confidence. People had lost faith in companies. They had lost faith in politicians. Some had even begun losing faith in the financial system itself. That was dangerous. A financial system runs on confidence. Banks depend on confidence. Credit depends on confidence. Government borrowing depends on confidence. Once confidence disappears, economic activity can slow dramatically. Walpole recognized this immediately. Unlike some politicians who focused primarily on assigning blame, Walpole focused on stabilization. He understood that punishment alone would not solve the problem. The country needed reassurance. Investors needed reassurance. Markets needed reassurance. And the government needed to demonstrate that it remained in control. This was not an easy task. The losses were enormous. Public anger was intense. Newspapers reported scandal after scandal. Every day seemed to bring fresh accusations against company officials and political insiders. Many people wanted dramatic action. Some demanded severe punishment. Others demanded sweeping reforms. Walpole chose a more measured approach. He believed restoring confidence was more important than satisfying public anger. That decision was controversial. Critics accused him of protecting powerful interests. Supporters argued that he was preventing a larger disaster. History has generally been kind to Walpole. Many historians believe his actions helped prevent a deeper financial crisis. One of his key objectives was protecting Britain's credit system. The government still needed to borrow money. Trade still needed financing. Businesses still needed investment. If confidence collapsed completely, the consequences could spread throughout the economy. Walpole therefore worked to redistribute some of the South Sea Company's obligations. He coordinated arrangements involving other financial institutions. He encouraged solutions that would reduce panic rather than intensify it. In modern terms, he was attempting to contain systemic risk. The phrase did not exist in 1720. The concept certainly did. The challenge was enormous. Financial crises are often fueled by fear. And fear can spread faster than facts. A rumor can travel through a city in hours. A loss of confidence can spread through a nation in days. Walpole understood that restoring trust would take much longer. Slowly, the situation began stabilizing. The panic eased. Markets became calmer. The immediate danger passed. Many investors never recovered their losses. But Britain avoided a complete financial breakdown. That achievement significantly strengthened Walpole's political position. In the years that followed, he became one of the most powerful figures in British politics. His influence would shape the country for decades. Ironically, the disaster that destroyed so many fortunes helped create one of Britain's most important political careers. And that career would play a major role in shaping the future of the British state. The South Sea Bubble had produced many victims. It had also produced an unlikely survivor. A politician who understood that restoring confidence can sometimes be just as important as finding blame. And in the aftermath of one of history's greatest financial manias, that understanding may have saved Britain from an even larger crisis. Another lasting consequence of the South Sea Bubble involved a piece of legislation that would influence British business for more than a century. It became known as the Bubble Act of 1720. Today, the Bubble Act is often described in simple terms. Many people believe it was a law created to stop speculative bubbles. The reality was more complicated. Like many laws passed during periods of crisis, it emerged from a mixture of good intentions, political interests, and unintended consequences. To understand the Bubble Act, we must return to the height of the mania. As South Sea shares soared, hundreds of new business schemes appeared across Britain. Some proposed legitimate ventures. Others were highly questionable. Many existed only on paper. Promoters promised profits from mining projects, overseas trade, engineering innovations, insurance schemes, and countless other enterprises. Investors poured money into opportunities they barely understood. The atmosphere resembled a gold rush. Every week seemed to produce another exciting investment opportunity. Government officials grew concerned. Speculation was spreading rapidly. Many feared that fraudulent schemes would damage confidence in financial markets. Supporters of regulation argued that action was necessary. They believed investors needed protection. They believed financial stability needed protection. And they believed the government should intervene before speculation became uncontrollable. That argument led to the Bubble Act. The law restricted the creation of certain joint stock companies unless they received proper authorization. In theory, the objective was straightforward. Prevent dubious enterprises from raising money from the public. Reduce reckless speculation. Protect investors. At first glance, this seems reasonable. Yet critics have long pointed out an important detail. The South Sea Company itself benefited from the law. Many competing ventures faced restrictions. The South Sea Company did not. This created suspicions. Was the Bubble Act truly designed to protect investors? Or was it partly designed to protect established financial interests from competition? Historians continue debating the question. The answer is probably both. Governments often pursue multiple objectives simultaneously. Some lawmakers likely wanted genuine reform. Others likely wanted to strengthen politically connected institutions. Whatever the motivation, the law produced mixed results. It did not prevent the South Sea Bubble from collapsing. The crash occurred anyway. It did not eliminate speculation. Human beings continued speculating long after 1720. And it did not permanently solve the problems it was intended to address. In fact, some historians argue that the Bubble Act may have slowed aspects of business development. By making it more difficult for certain companies to organize as joint stock enterprises, the law limited access to capital for some entrepreneurs. Innovative projects sometimes struggled to obtain funding. Economic opportunities may have been delayed. This illustrates an important lesson about regulation. Rules often solve one problem while creating another. The challenge is finding balance. Too little regulation can encourage fraud and instability. Too much regulation can restrict innovation and growth. The Bubble Act became an early example of this dilemma. For more than a century, its influence remained part of Britain's legal landscape. Eventually, attitudes changed. Economic growth accelerated. Industrialization transformed society. Business organizations evolved. And many of the restrictions associated with the Bubble Act gradually became obsolete. The law was ultimately repealed in the 19th century. Yet its historical significance remained. The Bubble Act represented one of the earliest attempts by a modern government to respond to a major financial crisis through regulation. It reflected fears about speculation. It reflected concerns about investor protection. And it reflected the growing realization that financial markets could affect entire societies. Today, debates about regulation continue. Governments still struggle to balance freedom and oversight. Investors still debate how much intervention is appropriate. Financial crises still provoke calls for reform. In that sense, the Bubble Act feels surprisingly modern. Its language belongs to the 18th century. Its questions belong to every century. How much freedom should markets have? How much protection do investors need? And how can societies encourage innovation without encouraging disaster? The lawmakers of 1720 wrestled with those questions. More than 300 years later, we are still searching for the answers. When people study the South Sea Bubble, they often focus on famous names. They remember Isaac Newton. They remember company directors. They remember politicians and wealthy investors. Yet the true human cost of the disaster extended far beyond the elite. Thousands of ordinary people were affected. Their names rarely appear in history books. But their experiences reveal the real consequences of financial manias. For many investors, the South Sea Bubble represented more than an opportunity to become rich. It represented a chance to improve their lives. Some hoped to secure a comfortable retirement. Others hoped to provide better futures for their children. Some wanted financial independence. Others simply wanted to participate in what appeared to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. These motivations were understandable. They remain understandable today. Most people do not invest because they are greedy. They invest because they want security. They want opportunity. They want progress. The tragedy of the South Sea Bubble is that many people pursuing those goals found themselves moving in the opposite direction. Consider the merchant who invested business savings into South Sea shares. During the boom, rising prices appeared to validate the decision. The merchant felt smarter, more confident, more successful. Then the crash arrived. The profits disappeared. The capital disappeared. And the business itself might suddenly face financial difficulties. Or consider a widow living on inherited wealth. The promise of higher returns may have seemed attractive. After all, preserving wealth was a constant concern. Many investors in similar situations believed the South Sea Company offered both safety and opportunity. When prices collapsed, that belief proved devastating. Some families saw years of accumulated savings disappear. Others found themselves trapped by obligations they could no longer meet. The emotional impact was often as severe as the financial impact. People experienced shame, embarrassment, regret, fear. Financial losses are rarely just numbers. They affect relationships. They affect confidence. They affect people's sense of security. The South Sea Bubble demonstrated this reality on a national scale. One reason bubbles are so destructive is that they encourage people to make decisions based on expectations rather than circumstances. A family expecting future gains may spend differently, borrow differently, plan differently. When those expectations collapse, life must suddenly be reorganized around a new reality. That adjustment can be painful. Sometimes extremely painful. Historical records contain accounts of ruined fortunes, damaged reputations, and broken financial plans. Not every investor was destroyed. Some exited early. Some limited their exposure. Some were fortunate. But many were not. The stories differed. The disappointment was widespread. And yet, there is another side to this story. The South Sea Bubble also revealed remarkable resilience. Many people rebuilt their lives. Businesses recovered. Families adapted. Communities moved forward. The losses were real. The suffering was real. But society continued functioning. This resilience is often overlooked when discussing financial crises. Attention naturally focuses on the collapse. Less attention is paid to recovery. Yet recovery is an important part of the historical record. Britain did not disappear after 1720. Its economy continued evolving. Its institutions continued developing. Its citizens continued pursuing opportunity. The same pattern appears after many financial crises. The immediate damage can feel overwhelming. But over time, individuals and societies adapt. That does not erase the losses. It does not undo the mistakes. It simply reminds us that human history is not defined solely by failure. It is also defined by recovery. The victims of the South Sea Bubble deserve to be remembered. Not merely as statistics. Not merely as investors. But as people. People who hoped for a better future. People who made decisions under uncertainty. And people who discovered, often painfully, that markets can be far less predictable than they appear during times of prosperity. Their experiences transformed the South Sea Bubble from a financial event into a human story. And that human story remains just as compelling today as it was in 1720. To fully appreciate the significance of the South Sea Bubble, it helps to compare it with other great financial manias throughout history. At first glance, these events seem very different. They occurred in different countries. They involved different technologies, different industries, different generations. Yet beneath the surface, the similarities are striking. One of the earliest examples often compared to the South Sea Bubble is the Dutch tulip mania of the 17th century. During that episode, certain rare tulip bulbs reached astonishing prices. Stories of fortunes made through tulip trading spread rapidly. Speculation increased. Prices climbed to extraordinary levels. Then confidence weakened. And the market collapsed. For centuries, tulip mania has been used as a symbol of irrational speculation. Whether every popular story about the event is accurate remains debated among historians. What matters for our purposes is that the same emotional forces were present. Optimism, social pressure, fear of missing out, the belief that prices would continue rising. The South Sea Bubble displayed those same characteristics. A century later, similar patterns appeared again. During the 19th century, railway investments captured the public imagination. In Britain, the railway mania of the 1840s attracted enormous enthusiasm. Investors believed railroads would transform transportation and commerce. They were correct. Railroads did transform society. Yet many railway companies still became wildly overvalued. Investors once again confused a revolutionary idea with a guaranteed investment success. The distinction proved costly. The pattern repeated in the 20th century. During the Roaring Twenties in the United States, stock prices rose rapidly. Economic growth appeared strong. Technological innovation seemed unstoppable. Many people believed prosperity would continue indefinitely. Then came the crash of 1929. The Great Depression followed. The details differed from the South Sea Bubble. The psychology did not. Once again, optimism had outrun reality. Toward the end of the 20th century, another example emerged. The dot-com boom. The Internet was transforming the world. Investors recognized that fact. Their mistake was assuming every company associated with the Internet would become enormously profitable. businesses with limited revenue achieved extraordinary valuations. Stock prices soared. Media coverage intensified. Speculation spread. Then the bubble burst. Many companies disappeared. Billions of dollars in market value evaporated. Yet the Internet itself survived and continued changing the world. This is a crucial point. A bubble can form around a genuine innovation. The South Sea bubble teaches this lesson clearly. The problem is not always the underlying idea. The problem is often the price investors are willing to pay. More recently, housing markets, cryptocurrency markets, and various technology sectors have experienced periods of extraordinary enthusiasm. Each episode possesses unique characteristics. Yet certain themes continue appearing. A compelling story, rising prices, growing confidence, expanding participation, diminishing skepticism. Eventually, a correction. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. That famous observation captures something important. The South Sea bubble was not an isolated accident. It was part of a broader pattern visible throughout financial history. Understanding that pattern does not guarantee protection from future bubbles. If it did, bubbles would no longer exist. What understanding can provide is perspective. It can help investors recognize warning signs. It can encourage caution when excitement becomes extreme. And it can remind us that extraordinary claims deserve careful examination. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the South Sea bubble is not that it happened. The remarkable thing is how familiar it feels. 300 years separate us from the investors of 1720. Yet their hopes sound familiar. Their fears sound familiar. Even their mistakes sound familiar. That continuity reveals something profound. Markets evolve. Technology evolves. Human nature evolves very slowly. And as long as human nature remains largely unchanged, the forces that created the South Sea bubble will continue appearing in new forms. New assets. New industries. New opportunities. But often, the same emotions. The same dreams. And occasionally, the same consequences. As we move toward the final chapters of this story, it is worth asking a question that historians, economists, and investors have debated for centuries. Could the South Sea bubble happen again? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Modern markets are larger. Information travels instantly. Financial regulations are far more sophisticated. Investors have access to data that people in 1720 could never have imagined. Surely such a disaster could not occur in exactly the same way. And that is true. The specific circumstances of the South Sea bubble belong to a particular moment in history. The British Empire of 1720 no longer exists. The South Sea Company no longer exists. The world that produced the bubble has vanished. Yet the underlying forces remain surprisingly familiar. Human beings still respond to stories. They still respond to social pressure. They still respond to the possibility of extraordinary wealth. In many ways, financial markets are giant collections of human emotions. Those emotions can be measured imperfectly. They can be studied. But they cannot be eliminated. This is why speculative booms continue appearing. Not because investors are ignorant. Not because they fail to learn history. But because each generation encounters new opportunities that seem unique. When a revolutionary technology emerges, excitement is understandable. When a new industry begins transforming society, optimism is reasonable. Problems arise when reasonable optimism becomes unquestioned certainty. The South Sea bubble illustrates this transition better than almost any event in financial history. At the beginning, investors saw opportunity. By the peak, many saw inevitability. They no longer asked whether profits would arrive. They asked only how large those profits would become. That shift transformed investment into speculation, and speculation into mania. The same pattern has appeared repeatedly over the centuries. The details change. The psychological progression remains remarkably similar. At first, skepticism dominates. Then curiosity grows. Then enthusiasm. Then excitement. Then euphoria. Finally, confidence becomes so widespread that many people stop imagining alternative outcomes. That is often the moment when risk is greatest. Because markets function best when diverse opinions exist. When everyone agrees, caution tends to disappear. The South Sea bubble reminds us that disagreement can be healthy. Skepticism can be valuable. Questions can be valuable. During the mania, many warning signs were visible. Some observers recognized them. Most chose to ignore them. Not because the warnings were hidden, but because optimism was more attractive. This may be the most difficult lesson for investors to accept. Information alone is not enough. Many people possess the information necessary to question the bubble. What they lacked was the willingness to act upon it. The challenge was psychological rather than intellectual. And psychological challenges rarely disappear. Even today, investors face similar pressures. News headlines celebrate success. Social media amplifies excitement. Stories of extraordinary gains spread rapidly. The fear of missing out remains powerful. The desire to belong remains powerful. The temptation to believe that this time is different remains powerful. That phrase deserves special attention. This time is different. It has appeared in countless forms throughout financial history. Investors in every era find reasons to believe that old rules no longer apply. Sometimes the reasons sound convincing. Occasionally, they contain elements of truth. Yet markets continue reminding people that basic principles endure. Value matters. Risk matters. Reality matters. The South Sea bubble became famous because it exposed what happens when those principles are forgotten. Its lessons remain relevant not because history repeats perfectly, but because human behavior often repeats familiar patterns. And as long as people continue seeking wealth, opportunity, and a better future, those patterns will likely remain part of the financial world. The names may change. The assets may change. The technology may change. But the underlying story remains remarkably familiar. A story about belief. A story about confidence. And ultimately, a story about the delicate line between optimism and illusion. In the end, the South Sea bubble was never really about a company. Yes, the South Sea Company stood at the center of the story. Its shares soared. Its shares collapsed. Its directors faced investigation. Its name became permanently linked to one of history's most famous financial disasters. But the deeper story reaches far beyond a single corporation. At its heart, the South Sea bubble was a story about human nature. A story about what happens when ambition, opportunity, and imagination collide. The investors of 1720 were not irrational monsters from a distant past. They were people. People who wanted better lives. People who hoped to secure financial independence. People who wanted to participate in what appeared to be a historic opportunity. Those desires were understandable. They remain understandable today. In fact, they are among the most universal human motivations. That is one reason the story continues to resonate. The people involved do not feel entirely foreign. Their world was different. Their dreams were not. When the South Sea Company's stock began rising, investors experienced something powerful. Possibility. The possibility of wealth. The possibility of advancement. The possibility that the future might be dramatically better than the present. Possibility can inspire remarkable achievements. It can also cloud judgment. The challenge lies in distinguishing genuine opportunity from unrealistic expectation. That challenge existed in 1720. It exists today. And it will almost certainly exist in the future. The South Sea Bubble reminds us that markets are not simply mechanisms for allocating capital. They are also arenas where hopes and fears compete. Every investment reflects a belief about the future. Every market price reflects countless expectations. When those expectations remain grounded in reality, markets can be extraordinarily effective. When expectations become detached from reality, trouble often follows. This lesson has survived for more than 3 centuries because it extends beyond finance. The same principle appears in politics, in business, in technology, even in everyday life. Human beings are storytellers. We create narratives about what the future might become. Those narratives help us make decisions. They help us organize complex information. But narratives can also become so compelling that they overshadow evidence. The South Sea Bubble demonstrated that danger with remarkable clarity. Millions of pounds were invested not merely in a company, but in a story. A story about limitless opportunity. A story about national prosperity. A story about wealth waiting just over the horizon. For a time, that story seemed undeniable. Then reality intervened. And reality proved stronger. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the bubble. Reality may move slowly. It may be ignored temporarily. It may be overshadowed by excitement. But eventually, reality demands recognition. When it does, markets adjust. Sometimes gently. Sometimes violently. In 1720, the adjustment was painful. Fortunes disappeared. Reputations collapsed. Trust was damaged. Yet from that pain emerged understanding. Future generations gained a clearer picture of how markets function. Economists gained one of history's most valuable case studies. Investors gained a warning. And historians gained a story that continues to illuminate the relationship between money and human behavior. More than 300 years later, the South Sea Bubble still speaks to us. Not because the company mattered. Not because the stock mattered. But because the people mattered. Their hopes mattered. Their fears mattered. Their mistakes mattered. And their experiences continue offering lessons to anyone willing to listen. The coffeehouses of London are quieter now. The traders of 1720 are long gone. The South Sea Company belongs to history. Yet the questions raised by the bubble remain remarkably alive. How much risk is too much? How should investors evaluate opportunity? How can societies encourage innovation without encouraging excess? And perhaps most importantly, how can human beings remain rational when surrounded by excitement? 3 centuries later, we are still searching for the answers. And that may be why the story of the South Sea Bubble will never truly end.